Welcome to another episode of Sustainability Talks, the podcast at the forefront of sustainable innovation and impact investing, brought to you by ETF Partners, Europe's original sustainability venture capital fund. I am your host, Remy de Tonnac, senior partner at ETF Partners. So today, I am so very happy to welcome our guest, John Elkington, a world authority on corporate responsibility and sustainable development. John is the author of over 20 books, advisor and board members to dozens of companies, including some of the largest like Ford, Procter & Gamble, Shell, etc. He's as well an entrepreneur and founder of 4 companies. And over the years, John has significantly shaped the discourse around corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. So it is going to be a great conversation with invaluable insight, well, for everybody interested in the sustainability world.
That's quite the build-up, Remy. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And I'm not even sure that it is giving credit to everything that you have done, but we are going to come back to that. Again, thousand thanks for being with us. My first question, it may be seen as a strange one. Of the many hats that you have been wearing, are still wearing, author, entrepreneur in sustainability, visiting professor in 3 different universities. I forgot to mention that. Chief pollination officer with your company today, board director and advisor to many corporates, activist with the WWF or Greenpeace or other organization. Which one do you like the most? Or which one do you think you are the most proud of?
That's an impossible question, Remy, as you well know. I mean, and it isn't as though I'm constantly changing hats because I am what I am, and what I am is very curious. I'm, as we would say here in my own country, I'm nosy. I'm constantly interested in what other people are doing. But if you forced me to choose just one of those hats, I really enjoy being in conversation with people. And when we set up new companies, one of the first bits of equipment that we put in is sofas, couches, because that's where the conversations usually happen. In fact, I was once in Australia, I think it was in Melbourne, I mean, probably about 30 years ago, and somebody in public, hundreds of people in the audience, asked me, "What's your most important strategic tool?" And I said, well, it's probably our sofas. And the books are part of that, and the speaking is part of that, and the advisory work is part of that. But I think ultimately, it's conversations like this one where I'm learning. I'm not just sort of pontificating, telling the world how things would be, but I'm just coming up constantly a set of learning curves. So I think that's probably my answer.
Okay, so if you allow me, John, I will dare to take your shoes with my own experience and tell you
Yes.
that, in my view, the thing that I would be the most proud of is your positive activist role with corporates. Why? For 2 main reasons. Because you started at a time when nobody had no clue about what it was, and even less corporates, and they were seeing people like you, like radical activists, not positive activists, in the 70s and 80s. So being an advocate of sustainability with this guy was something probably extremely difficult and very, very important, because there is nothing you can do in this world without the support of the big corporates who have so much lobbying power. And therefore, you have been very instrumental in making a kind of cultural revolution happen with these guys. And therefore, with concept like the green growth, making these people understand that it is not either or, it is both things together. So this is what I would see in my shoes as maybe the most important contribution and the most difficult one, and still in the same spirit. In the very early days of your engagement, at a time when you were not the well-known or famous John Elkington, have you been somehow discouraged, or have you had moment of difficulty as you were trying to engage with this corporate on topics that they didn't want to hear about?
Well, it wasn't just the corporates who were uneasy with my engaging them. There were many people in the environmental field, and they were my friends, they were my colleagues. That was part of the environmentalism movement, was part of my sort of first real learning curve. And they really didn't like business at all. And therefore, the fact that somebody might go very close into these companies and help them rethink their positionings on all of this. I remember once a Greenpeace director telling me, "Oh, this is decades ago, but basically, what you're doing is going to get us nowhere. What you've got to do is just tie them down with regulations and beat them up every possible way you can." And my response then, and it would still be, is that, well, I think you've got to do that sometimes. And if you're dealing with criminals or people who are really recalcitrant, yes, you've got to pressure them pretty intensely. But at the same time, if that's what you're going to do, and that's what the companies know you're going to do, then they just put their lawyers up in front of you and they fight as dirty as they need to, or dirtily as they need to. And so if you're going to get the innovation, if you're going to get the creativity that business, as you say, can potentially bring to bear on all of this, you've got to approach them in a very different way. So to your question, just very quickly about have there been difficult moments? Look, life has been full of those difficult moments. We all know that. At one level, I could say I've been sued by three different parts of the same chemical company at the same time, even though I was working with the chairman at the time. I've been sued by McDonald's for a book that we did called The Green Consumer Guide. I don't enjoy that. In fact, it's pretty punishing when you think that a company like McDonald's is going to destroy your company. At that stage, it was a company called Sustainability, which we set up in 1987. But through it all, it's been character forming at times, as we might say. But it's been a great privilege, and often it's been a great pleasure to work with really great people, trying to define an agenda and then help people. People, as you will well know, in the business world and the financial markets and so on, don't intentionally every morning get up going out to destroy the world. I mean, or to destabilize the climate or whatever it is. I mean, they want to broadly do the right thing by their families and children and grandchildren, the rest of it. The question is, how can we help them understand what that would imply, and not only just to do it, but to do it and make business sense out of that at the same time.
I love it. In fact, maybe you could tell us the whole story around McDonald's, because I find it fascinating. David against Goliath.
Well, it was very funny. The idea of a particular book called The Green Consumer Guide, you kindly mentioned that concept.
That you sold in millions.
Yeah, well, it sold 1 million copies in the first 18 months, and that was 1988. And it really upset a number of companies who had been our clients, who then became our clients. I thought actually the book would destroy my then consulting business, but it didn't. It brought companies in a very different state of mind, because we weren't simply saying business is bad. We were saying, here are some of the products that you may want to buy and some of the issues associated with them. These are some of the brands that you may want to consider as you buy those products. And these are some of the companies and their environmental track records that stand behind those brands. So McDonald's, you mentioned, they were one of the companies who found that book, and it went into 20 foreign language editions in very short order, was really pressing in on their business. And some companies were very sensible. Novo Nordisk in Denmark was a prime example of that. But McDonald's just defaulted to lawyers. And the first we knew of what was going to happen was then their lawyers got in touch and said, you've got to take the book out of every bookstore in the United Kingdom. This was when it was #1 in the nonfiction bestseller list. So we did that. We had to do that. But to your question, I'd never been sued by such a big company before, and it was terrifying. And so we went to see lawyers and said, how can we make sense of this? And they said, well, you can't. If you're dealing with a company like McDonald's, if they have to, they'll pay people to perjure themselves, almost sort of give false evidence in order to get you on the hook. But just as I was leaving, one of the lawyers who we were talking to said, unless of course you want to play poker. And I think I'd mentioned to you in an earlier conversation that what then happened was that evening I went down to Cardiff in Wales and I did a BBC program. 8 million people listened. It was a radio program. There were 80 people in the live audience. I was on a panel with 3 other speakers. One of them repeated verbatim on air some of the accusations about McDonald's that were in the book. So that went out to 8 million people. And there were 2 people, it turned out, in the audience from McDonald's who literally ran up to me afterwards and said, you can't do this. You're under a legal injunction. And I said, well, firstly, it wasn't me. And then I said, and this is where the poker started going. I think I mentioned I'd never played poker, but I knew what the principle was. So it was partly bluffing. So I said, well, we're now prepared to meet you in court. Because we've talked to Greenpeace, that's true. We talked to Friends of the Earth, that was true. We now have enough evidence that we're quite confident that we'll beat you in court. And this woman went very, very quiet and then said, would you talk to our president? So I said, well, if he will call me, which he did first thing the following morning. And then he basically said, what would it take to get you off our back? And I said, well, 2 things. One is proof that you have a coherent written environmental policy statement. And secondly, that you have the methods to ensure that it's being implemented right around the world. And he went very, 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 very quiet. And then he said, well, give us 2 weeks. And I won't go through the full story, but it ended up with McDonald's after a 5-hour meeting saying, would we work with them? And I said, over my dead body, not having seen what I've seen at the company that I have seen. But a few months later, an American group, the Environmental Defense Fund, started to work with McDonald's. And I was really pleased because they started to get into some really important areas. And that's, in a way, that's part of what I've tried to do, which is to open up business. So not just my companies or, the people I'm friends with can get involved, but that others can then get involved. And sometimes they're competitive, sometimes that is competitive, but very often it's in the spirit of collaboration or competition.
Oh, I really like the story, and that's a beautiful story about making good out of a very bad start.
Yes.
Plus, I mean, you could have accepted, in fact, to work for them because you offered them free advice that were worth a lot, a lot.
Yeah.
So anyway, if we now get back to the very beginning, tell us, how is it that in the 70s, again, at a time when nobody or very few people cared about sustainability, what is it in the first place that took you to engage in that field, and especially with the corporate at the time? What was in the early years of John, what took him there?
Well, I was partly raised outside my own country, outside Britain. So I came back to the country when I was 9. So I always felt something of an alien. So environmentalism, when it came along, fitted quite nicely because it just made me even more of an alien than I had been up to that point. And even my parents took 20 years to understand what the hell it was that I thought that I was doing. But my father was a pilot and I was interested in aircraft. And so when I was at school and I first came back to England, I was sent away to school, and I used to send off to American, particularly aerospace companies, and ask for information on their aircraft. And they'd send me these huge, great packages of photographs and catalogs and annual reports and so on. I don't know whether they thought I was going to buy some of their aircrafts, but anyway, it was part of their publicity outreach, I suppose. And I became really interested to think, here are these products that we see flying in the air, but there are these companies behind them with these supply chains and so on I find that really interesting. So really that interest in business was there from when I was 10, 11, 12, I suppose, environmentalism really took off for me when I was 11. And at the same school, I was suddenly standing up in front of all the boys and asking them for their allowances or pocket money for 2 weeks. And I had no, and getting the money and sending it off to the World Wildlife Fund in its first year. It was 1961. And for years afterwards, I had no idea why that had happened because I was really paralytically shy. I wouldn't talk in groups of people at the time, but something seized me and made me do that. And then I set up a company in 1978 with somebody called Max Nicholson, who was one of the founders of WWF. And he asked me, "What got you?" This your question. What got you involved? And I said, "Well, there was this odd thing. I found myself surrounded by lots of baby eels in Northern Ireland when I was 6. And then there was this moment with raising funds for WWF. And he said, I know exactly what started you off. And I said, no, how could you possibly? And he said, well, the founders of WWF had got 8 pages in a major newspaper. And as soon as he said that, I could remember going into the school library, reading this newspaper and stand, suddenly think, I've got to do something. And so the environment and business were there from the very earliest phases. But at that stage, there was no career path. If you wanted to become a nature warden or something like that, or a safari guide or something, you could do that. But there really was no proper career path into environmental roles, certainly in business. And so I went and did a postgraduate degree in city planning because I thought, well, that's about as close as I'm going to get to this. And I came out from that, and in my pigeonhole, in my mailbox, it was a physical mailbox in those days. There was this letter from a little environmental consultancy in Covent Garden in London saying, "Come and see us." And so I went to see them, and that was 1974. I worked with them for 4 years, did really fascinating projects in places like Singapore, Egypt, some of the earliest environmental impact assessments in the world. But through that period, and I'll stop after this, through that period, I started to become really curious about how not just central governments and local governments were being impacted by this, but how business was. And I started to write a series of features articles for New Scientist, one of our magazines, and I did that for 5 years as a part-time thing. And I just found the more I did that, the more fascinating it was. And so when I was asked to set up environmental data services by Max Nicholson in 1978, I did. And that started really the mainstreaming of the business side of what I've done.
Okay, so it was more out of a ethical, personal ground and not at all with the view of making a career.
It was never about making a career. In fact, the number of times people advised me to do something grown up, to use a phrase you used earlier on. I mean, to join the armed forces like my father had, or become a merchant banker. He met somebody on a train. He thought that would be a good career path. But what I was doing, as I said, I really made no sense to his generation. And when I started, as you said too, to engage business, I found that people who were running businesses were part of the Second World War generation. They were incredibly different. Their life experience was so different from the baby boom generation of what I was doing. So precisely as you say, they saw people like me as really the enemy. That we were, as they would later put it, the watermelon. We were green on the outside, but we were actually red in the middle.
Yeah,
We were communists.
yeah.
And it took some time to get over that. But I was extremely lucky because my education, I could say my accent, my curiosity, and my sort of openness to being persuaded. I think all of those helped get me in places where others struggled.
Yeah, I believe a lot of other people would have struggled and have struggled in that space at the time. So let's move forward. In fact, fast forward after
Yes.
the green consumer, the green growth, and then came the big moment of the triple bottom line in '94. Can you tell us a little bit how you came to that? What was the process?
Well, I sometimes tell people that this process of getting to the triple bottom line took me 18 months. 18 months to get 3 words. I mean, ridiculous. I felt that there was something wrong. And what was then called the Business Council for Sustainable Development, now WPCSD, had this concept of eco-efficiency. It made a lot of sense if you were an engineer. And it was basically about how do you make or save money by doing the right thing? Waste management, pollution control, energy efficiency, all of that good stuff. And I thought, well, that's nice, but that's only part of the story. And there are social components to this, and we talk about making money, but there's a financial side of this, and beyond that, there's an economic side of it. So I just was trying to get a term, and then that would cover that. And then I woke up one morning with the triple bottom line in my brain, and I thought Paul McCartney once said he woke up one morning with the song Yesterday in his mind. And I'm not comparing at all, but he said he thought he'd heard it somewhere else before. And that exactly described
Uh-huh.
my sense as I woke up with this idea. And about 15, 20 years later, I discovered that I had heard not that phrase before, but something very like it. There was a guy called Alvin Toffler. He
Yeah,
did books like Future Shock, The Third Wave.
yeah.
And I was reading, I very rarely go back to books, but I went back to his book, The Third Wave. And in about 200, page 200 and something, I found this subtitle, Multiple Bottom Lines. And I thought, that's it. That's where this idea took root in my brain. It took a very long time to, because that book came out in 1980, and it wasn't until 1994 that I came up with the triple bottom line. But in a sense, that's where it came from. And then once it was out there, people thought, oh, well, of course, I mean, that makes sense. That was 94, 95, I came up with People, Planet, and Profit, just to make it a little bit more palatable to people. But looking back now, it sort of makes sense as a story. I can't say that when I was immersed in it, it was always very clear where it was headed.
No, it had definitely a huge impact. It is only recently that I learned that you were the father of the triple bottom line that I've been
Mm.
using again and again, and People, Planet, Profit. So, given the impact that it had, why is it that you made this famous recall, the first in history of management or strategic consulting? I don't know how to phrase it.
Well, I wish I could claim that I had a deeply, deeply logical and rational brain. It has its moments, but basically, it's intuitive and it's emotional, and it moves in big jumps, or it doesn't move at all. And with the product recall, which I did for the triple bottom line, it wasn't because I thought it was a bad idea. It was simply that I looked at how people were using the
Yeah.
concept. And I'd worked with the Global Reporting Initiative, which was all about the triple bottom line. I'd worked with the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes for 9 years. That was all about the triple bottom line. I'd worked with the B Corporation movement, again, all about the triple bottom line. So there was great work being done. But what I often heard people in effect doing was trading off one bottom line against another. So for example, they would say, we've made a profit. That's tick on the economic side. Well, no, it wasn't. That was only one small part of the economic story. Then they would say, and we've provided jobs for people, good jobs. We've provided products and services that people are prepared to buy. So socially, we're doing good work as well. Shame about the environment. But it was that sort of trade-off mentality. And the whole idea of the triple bottom line from the very outset was it was something that you should perform against all three dimensions and succeed in all three
Yeah.
dimensions, not fail. And one of my friends who's a CEO, was CEO then of a buyer in Germany, company, Biomaterial Sciences, spun out as Covestro. His name's Patrick Thomas. Put it in a way that I hadn't explained it myself. He basically said, what it means is that you perform well against two bottom lines as a minimum, and do not go backwards on the third. That's the way that he always
Yeah.
thought. So the recall, when I did it, I'd worked with companies like Ford, I'd worked with companies like Volvo and Toyota, and I knew what a product recall was, which is you have a perfectly good product, but something goes wrong. So you pull it back, you fix the problem, you put it back out on the road. But when I announced the product recall, which was really tongue in cheek, I mean, it was slightly a joke. just as a provocation, a bit like Zen Buddhism. Some people thought, oh, well, that's the end of the story. You know, that the triple bottom line is dead. Its architect has said it's sort of over. That wasn't what I was meaning by the recall.
Yeah.
Most people understood, and most people were very positive about it. So anyway, that's why I got to that point.
But did you? Yeah, I heard as well. I don't know whether you were the one saying that you didn't like the placebo effect around the way the triple bottom line was implemented. But did you do after some kind of clarification, a reintroduction, or is it just that the triple bottom line has been continuing, especially with the B Corp lab companies?
No, thank you for the question, Remy. And what actually happened was when you announce something that is a little bit explosive, like that initial product recall was, and Harvard Business Review, who published it, were extremely excited to have that story because
Yeah.
they said it was the first time any person who conceived of a management concept had actually publicly withdrawn it. And I told them even then, that's not the point. This is something that needs attention, it needs fixing, but it's not a bad idea. So
Mhm.
18 months after the recall, I came out with Green Swans, a book that you kindly mentioned. And in that, I laid out what I thought the answer was, which is the triple bottom line works perfectly well as long as you know how you're framing it. So for example, most people understand the triple bottom line in a corporate responsibility sense. So it's about being nicer, it's about being better, it's about being kinder to your suppliers and more open to you with your stakeholders and so on. And I said, well, look, that's absolutely fine. And that's where the triple bottom line is largely played out. But we're moving into a period where I think this was 2020. This was just before the pandemic hit. I think we're moving into a period where resilience becomes absolutely critical. And it's not just about being responsible, it's about being resilient right the way through your value chains and so on. And I think we're going to go through a period where very often we're forced onto the back foot and things that we had agreed to do previously we can't do because we've got now the pandemic, we've now got the war in Ukraine, we've got the need to sort of cut off Russian oil and gas or whatever it happens to be. And then so I started, the three P's were the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. And I said, well, actually, I think if you step up one, this was that complete accident, but if you step up one letter in the alphabet, you get R, and there you get responsibility, you get resilience. What comes after that? Well, regeneration comes after that, not just biological and ecological regeneration, but across the triple bottom line: economic, social, environmental, and crucially now political, because our democratic systems are very often in a state of disarray. We have got to regenerate, rebuild, restore those as well. So that's how I made sense of that process, at
Okay.
least for myself.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And if you look back, we are in 24, so it is now
Yeah.
about 30 years since you came with a triple bottom line and people, planet, profit. Would you see the glass half full or half empty regarding progress that have been made by corporates in that field?
Well, I was born an optimist. I often say you couldn't do what we both do if you didn't believe the world could progress. But also, if you look at history, it's very clear that that progress doesn't move in a straight line. It goes up, it goes down, it goes in, it goes out, and there's a massive amount of politics and mess and mistakes and accidents along the way. So, to your question, when I first engaged business, they absolutely did not want to talk about these issues at all. And if you approach them, they pushed you away with their public relations people or their lawyers. Now, every board, every supervisory management board, whatever it is in different parts of the world, every C-suite worth its salt in actually paying attention to what's going on in the wider world now has policies. It has people in roles like the chief sustainability officer. So
Mm.
that has changed profoundly. What worries me now is that there are hundreds of chief sustainability officers. Most of them are really extraordinarily interesting and committed people. But again, I see a problem, which is that business is tending to subcontract this change agenda to people who are seen to be
Yeah.
friendly with the outside world. Let them sort it out. Whereas this is actually systemic, it's structural. And, it's no accident a company like Ford, which I mentioned, is now splitting itself into two. One part doing the legacy internal combustion engine part of the business, one part doing electric vehicles. Solvay doing the same in different areas of the business. But this is structural. And if we simply ask one person in the C-suite to sort this out, I think that is a fundamental mistake. And I see too many companies making that sort of, in a way, strategic error at the moment.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree with you here. And I often say the day when a chief sustainability officer will be a full-time member of the executive committee, or when he will become the CEO of the company, then we know that
Yeah,
something has really
yeah,
drastically changed. And if I look at the last 30 years, as per my question, well, in 94, I was the CEO of a company. I had no clue about that. In 2016, I joined the Sustainability Through Innovation mission of ETF Partners, helping the world become more sustainable through technology innovation. And I can tell you, in those days, and just before that, I was the head of a company. There was nothing in our mission around sustainability. When I see today, in a matter of 8 years, you can really feel that it was not a linear progression. I would say probably 70% has happened of awareness, plan for action, call for action over the last 8 years. Even 8 years ago, you still had people, especially in the corporate world, claiming, well, global warming, we don't know. It is the trajectory of the Earth around the sun and blah, blah, blah. Today, no longer the case. So acceleration is clearly there. My next question is about, we have been talking about structural changes, and I know that in some of the lecture that you have been giving or in your books, you talk about the need for capitalism to reinvent itself, radical changes. Where do you see the most urgent need in terms of change that is requested for capitalism?
Well, I think one of the problems that we have, and I should be talking about solutions, and incidentally, I love what ETF have done, and I love the spirit of the organization. So well done to you and your colleagues for all of that. I think capitalism is what we're stuck with, whether we like it or not. There are going to be multiple different forms of it. I mean, you think about American capitalism, European variants, you think about Chinese capitalism and so on. This is not a single approach to anything. And I think its diversity will probably grow over time rather than shrink or converge, particularly in a period of deglobalization and some of the conflicts that I think are coming next. So it's very easy to talk about we've got to reinvent, rethink, whatever, capitalism. And that's not the way historically these things have happened. You've had these massive shifts in society. You've had Great Depressions, you've had wars, you've had Cold Wars, you've had these extraordinary tensions between rival ideological camps, some of them saying, free market, some of them are saying state-controlled industries and all the rest of it. So I think that tension has not gone away. I think that debate will continue to play through. And I don't think there's any one lever that any of us can pull beyond which everything will be transformed. But having said that, I think one of the mistakes that we're beginning to become more aware of is that if you think about corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, ESG, these different shared value, these different formulations, they've pretty much all focused on the individual company. yes, it's brand, yes, it's board, yes, it's business model, yes, it's supply chain and so on, but individual companies. And, I've been very much part of that movement. But what we've just seen in recent times has made me think much harder about, is that enough? And the answer is it's absolutely not enough. And it's these announcements, the CEOs of companies like Mercedes, Shell, Unilever have been making. Like Mercedes, I was with them a few weeks ago in Stuttgart, and their CEO recently announced that they were not going to hit their 100% electric vehicle target, publicly announced,
Mm.
by 2030. Well, now I can see all sorts of reasons why that might now be true for them, because the market is evolving slower than they had expected. But it's a sort of category error that you see incumbent companies make time and time again. They think that they've got time to work these things out, and they can slow down, when the past history of sort of innovation and structural change in markets suggests that the insurgents don't stop. And it's not just Tesla in the case of Mercedes, it's people like
Mm.
BYD. And so, yes, Europe's trying to hold out Chinese electric vehicles with up to 50% tariffs and so on. But those vehicles are still cheaper, even with the tariffs on. So I think with capitalism, we're going to have to think about several things at the same time. We're going to have to think about, how do we price critical elements of the challenge that we face? So the most obvious example is, how do we price carbon? And we have carbon trading mechanisms and all these sorts of things. The Chinese have multiple markets in that sort of space, but the price is not yet high enough to really, really influence behavior. So we've got to do that. So some of this is also about taxes. We've got to use taxes much more effectively than we have done today to steer our economies, which is not terribly popular in some parts of the world, but I think we've got to do a lot more. And it's fascinating to see Joe Biden in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act
Yeah.
being something very much like that. And I was just reading today that the number of factories opening in the United States has just broken all records, really because of that. So we can argue about whether that's the right way forward, but taxes are really important. But actually, one of the most important areas, and I think it's something we could talk about another date, is the world of money. So in different points of the evolution of this agenda, we focused on banks of all sorts of different types. We focused on insurance and reinsurance industries. We've looked at private equity, we've looked
Mhm.
at venture capital, but we've really not got to the heart of the financial market in such a way that all of those different sovereign wealth funds, that all of these different types of money under management become, as a default setting, part of the process of transformation. And I think what you at ETF have been doing is modeling some of the ways that not just venture capitalists, but other people in the money world will need to evolve and work out how to succeed over time. So when I talk about changing capitalism, I'm talking about a really messy business of working with lots of different sectors at the same time, lots of different geographies. But the crucial thing is that the generational shift has happened multiple times in business. I always think that generations of business take about 6 or 7 years to go through at the senior levels, rather than 30 plus years for human beings. So I'm probably dealing with the sort of ninth, 10th generation of senior leaders since I started this sort of work. And I think the younger people now totally understand what is coming at them. They know that they're going to have to do things that they don't yet understand how to do. Their business school educations didn't properly prepare them for all of this. So I think the next 10 to 15 years, you kindly mentioned my desire to know what I was going to be when I grow up. I'm 75 now. I feel I'm only just getting started. And I think the next 10 to 15 years will see more change than the last 50. But it won't all be breakthrough. There'll be a lot of breakdown along the way as well.
Yeah, yeah. And well, again, no surprise. I violently agree with you on on all of the points. And especially on the need for more regulated capitalism, taking the example of pricing, starting to really price better the carbon. It's good to
Yeah.
do calculate the carbon footprint, to do carbon accounting, but we should start really now getting all companies to understand what would be the P&L if we were to price the carbon, not even at a fraction of what it should be, and at a different level, the kind of positive activism that you were referring to. And for example, there are some very positive activists that are asking questions to the big banks who are still financing a lot of the fossil fuel assets. And just the fact of exercising this positive pressure is changing the behavior. It's different. It is not the green consumer, but it is in the same vein. Listen, John, I still have so many questions, but we'll organize another one for sure.
Well, just one final thought, which at least from me, which is I mentioned regeneration, and that
Yeah,
seems an enormous stretch for people at the moment. But I'm gonna just tell a very brief story to make a point, which is that just in the last 18 months to 2 years, you mentioned Walmart. Walmart, PepsiCo, Unilever, Nestle, Danone, all of these companies have made major public commitments to regenerative agriculture. And I think that's a really, really interesting trend. The problem that we often have is that you can put carbon in a spreadsheet, but you can't put soil health and biodiversity so easily as yet into a spreadsheet. So just doing the carbon piece, I think, is crucially important. But we've at the same time got to handle that biodiversity component as well. So some people will think, oh
yeah,
God, where's it going to end? But for me, that is part of the excitement and the joy of this space, that there is so much work still to be done. And we really
yeah,
need, everyone to pile in, particularly younger people, but they need support from older people. So here we
yeah.
are.
Here we are, still useful. And you,
Well, that's not guaranteed, but at least we try.
you somehow answered my very last
Oh
question
dear.
with your positive statement on regeneration. But the last question was going to be, given the scale and the complexity of the global sustainability challenges
Yeah.
we are facing, the relatively, again, half empty, half full, even though I have said that over the last 8 years, we have made immense progress. We are already, based on this year, we are above the 1.5-degree target. Huh?
Yeah.
So relative, still slow pace of achievement. Why and how do you stay motivated and inspired?
Well, I find the science on climate change and biodiversity loss absolutely terrifying. But I think that all of these major transformations in our societies and economies, as I said earlier on, don't go in a straight line. They bump along for a very, 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 very long time before suddenly there are one or more inflection points. And I think we're suddenly finding ourselves very, very close in to some of those inflection points. And part of the challenge for you and your team is to sort of pick which sectors, which technologies, which business models are going to play into all of this. And I think that's critical work. But it's also about politics now. And our whole agenda is becoming very much more politicized. And weirdly, I hate politics. I really don't like being involved in that world at all. But I think we've got to be more political. And just finally, to your question about why do I sort of remain fairly positive? I think the very fact that we're seeing people in Germany pushing it back against heat pumps, that we see farmers across Europe pushing back against wildlife-related regulation, we see the pushback against ESG and so on in the
Hmm.
United States, is because people finally are beginning to understand this is real. It's mainstreaming. It
Yeah,
has really structural, strategic implications for where we have put our assets in the past. We probably will have stranded assets if we're not very careful. And so I think the politics are reflecting that awakening. And so what an exciting time to be involved in all of this. And yeah, I just hope I've got the time to sort of continue playing with this, because I find it endlessly fascinating, and would love, Remy, at some stage to continue the conversation, hopefully
will.
sooner rather than later.
We will, whether it is just privately or through another.
I could be privately.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would agree with you. It has legs. It has a
Yeah.
lot of legs, powerful legs, more and more
Yeah.
powerful.
It has wings too.
Yeah.
So whether it's private, whether it's public, I look forward to a continuing conversation, Remy.
Merci, mille merci, John.
Merci à vous, merci à tout le monde.
Bravo. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join us as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.